Mr. President, I rise today to discuss the legislation that's come over from the House of Representatives that I must say I consider some of the most ill-considered legislation that I've ever seen come over from the other body. This legislation has been hastily thrown together, never had a hearing, and yet proposes to amend the Constitution of the United States in dramatic and draconian ways. And Mr. President, this is truly dangerous business. I have been part of the Fiscal Commission. I was part of the majority that supported its conclusions to reduce our debt from what it would otherwise be by $4 trillion. 11 of us supported that plan, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 independent. I have been for the last 6 months an active member of the group of 6, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. We've released our plan to reduce the debt from what it would otherwise be by $3.7 trillion. I've been part of putting out the Democratic Senate Budget Committee plan. I'm proud to say would reduce the debt from what it would otherwise be by $4 trillion. I have spoken in my entire career, 25 years here in the United States Senate, the dangers of deficit and debt, the risk of the debt threat to our country. I believe passionately that we've got to find a way to come together to reduce the danger of these runaway debts. But, Mr. President, this legislation that has come over from the House cannot be the answer. It is not bipartisan. It is super partisan. It is totally done on one side of the ledger. And, Mr. President, it will not pass, it will not become law, and it should not. Now, let's understand the context within which we're operating. First of all, as a country, we are borrowing 41 cents of every dollar that we spend. Our gross debt is now 100% of our gross domestic product. The best economists in the country have warned us that once you get to a debt that's more than 90% of your gross domestic product, your future economic prospects are endangered. Future economic growth is reduced. That's why, Mr. President, I have been deeply involved in every serious bipartisan attempt to reduce deficits and debt. But this proposal that has come over from the House, not having had a single hearing in this body, not one, is truly radical. Mr. President, again, I say to my colleagues, we have an urgent need to act, but we shouldn't panic. And unfortunately, I think that's what the House did when they sent us this half-baked concoction of ideas that don't hold together, that don't add up, and that would actually further threaten the economic recovery. There is no denying that we face a debt threat. This is what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said in June of last year. Our national debt is our biggest national security threat. And now we have had the rating agencies warn us that if we don't act, if we don't get our debt and deficits under control, they're going to downgrade U.S. debt's rating, the rating of U.S. debt, the rating of how the markets respond to our debt offerings. That would have a very serious impact on what we pay to borrow money. And remember, for every 1% increase in the interest rates we pay, it adds $1.3 trillion to the debt. Here's what the rating agencies have said. We may lower the long-term rating on the U.S. by 1 or more notches into the AA category in the next 3 months if we conclude that Congress and the administration have not achieved a credible solution to the rising U.S. government debt burden and are not likely to achieve one in the foreseeable future. Mr. President, that's why I joined the Group of Six some 6 months ago to produce a bipartisan plan to deal with the debt threat. And we've released that plan now. 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, many more of our colleagues on both sides have joined, have said they're with us. And so we've got a way forward. But it's certainly not the legislation that has come over here that we're considering today from the House of Representatives. This legislation would restrict the ability to respond to economic downturns and actually compound declines. It uses Social Security funds to calculate balance and subjects that program to the same cuts as other federal spending, even though we all understand that's totally separate from the rest of the budget. And it shifts ultimate decisions on budgeting to unelected and unaccountable judges. What a mistake that would be. And it requires a state ratification process that could take years to complete. We don't have years to deal with this problem. I'm afraid that this is mostly political theater that has been sent to us rather than a serious response to the problem. Perhaps most alarming, the proposal that is before us could turn a recession into a depression. Mr. President, we need to think very, very carefully how we respond to this debt threat, and then we need to react in a serious and credible way, and we've got to stand together with our colleagues. That's why I was proud to be a part of the Fiscal Commission, because we produced a plan that would get our debt under control and start reducing it. And there were 11 of us, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent, a majority of that commission that agreed to that plan. And it's why I've been proud to be part of the Group of Six, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans here that have produced a plan to control our debt and to begin to work it down. Mr. President, none of those plans and none of the other bipartisan plans would risk turning a recession into a depression. But that's exactly what the legislation from the House would do. Why do I say that? Well, here's one of the most respected scholars in this town. He's from the American Enterprise Institute. He called the balanced budget amendment that has come from the House a really dumb idea. This is what he said. Few ideas are more seductive on the surface and more destructive in reality than a balanced budget amendment. Here's why. Nearly all of our states have balanced budget requirements. That means when the economy slows, states are forced to raise taxes or slash spending at just the wrong time, providing a fiscal drag when what is needed is counter-cyclical policy to stimulate the economy. In fact, the fiscal drag from the states in the 2009-2010 period was barely countered by the federal stimulus plan. That meant the federal stimulus provided was nowhere near what was needed, but far better than doing nothing. Now imagine that scenario with a federal drag instead. Mr. Ornstein doesn't just imagine that. The Washington Post, in an editorial from last Friday, said rewriting the Constitution is the wrong way to deal with the debt. Let me just reference in their second column these words. Worse yet, the latest version would impose an absolute cap on spending as a share of the economy. It would prevent federal expenditures from exceeding 18% of the gross domestic product in any year. Most unfortunately, the amendment lacks a clause letting the government exceed that limit to strengthen a struggling economy. No matter how shaky the state of the economy, no matter how shaky the state of the union, rather, policymakers would be prevented from adopting emergency spending, such as the extension of unemployment insurance and other counter-cyclical expenses that have helped cushion the blow of the current economic downturn. Mr. President, two of the most distinguished economists in our country, Alan Blinder, the former deputy chairman of the Federal Reserve, and Mark Zandi, who was an advisor to John McCain's presidential campaign, studied the government response to the latest financial crisis. Here's what they concluded. We find that its effects on real GDP, jobs, and inflation are huge and probably averted what could have been called Great Depression 2.0. This amendment before us would have stopped the governmental response, which two of the nation's most distinguished economists tell us averted Great Depression 2.0. When all is said and done, the financial and fiscal policies will have cost taxpayers a substantial sum, but not nearly as much as most had feared, and not nearly as much as if policymakers had not acted at all. If the comprehensive policy responses saved the economy from another depression, as we estimate, they were well worth their cost. Mr. President, this amendment that is before us now would have prevented this response, would have prevented averting a Great Depression. Mr. President, here is the work of Zandi and Blinder with respect to what would have happened to jobs absent the federal response. Jobs with the federal response, the green line; jobs without the federal response, the red line. 8 million fewer jobs without the federal response to prevent a depression. Mr. President, unemployment, what would have happened without the federal response? According to this detailed study by Zandi and Blinder, without the federal response, unemployment today would be 16% instead of the 9% we're experiencing. We would be in a depression. Mr. President, that is the hard reality, and the amendment before us would have prevented that kind of governmental response. Now, Mr. President, they call this plan cut, cap, and balance. It should have called it cut, cap, and kill Medicare, because that's really what this plan would do. It would cut, cap, and kill Medicare. Why do I say that? Well, if we look at the House budget proposal that underlies this plan, we see what happens under traditional Medicare. Under Medicare now, the beneficiary pays 25% of their expenses. Under the Republican budget plan that underlies the amendment that's come before us, Medicare beneficiaries would pay 68% of the expenses of their health care. In other words, somebody who is Medicare eligible, qualifies for the program, pays their required costs, pays their required co-pays, pays their required premiums, currently pays 25% of the cost. Under the plan, the Republican plan from the House, that would increase to 68% over time. That stands Medicare on its head. Instead of Medicare, as normal insurance does, paying the lion's share, the individual would pay the lion's share of their health care expenses. Mr. President, the underlying House Republican plan that underlies this amendment would increase the out-of-pocket cost to a Medicare beneficiary from $6,000 to $12,500. That would be health spending for a typical 65-year-old Medicare beneficiary in 2022. Instead of paying $6,000 under current law, they would pay $12,500. Now, somebody who's been following the details will look at these numbers and say, well, Senator Conrad, what you've outlined there is the House Republican plan, and what's been sent you in an amendment actually is even more draconian than the House Republican plan. Goes even further, cuts Medicare even more. And yes, Mr. President, that's true. I have understated very substantially the devastation that would be done to Medicare under the amendments before us. Well, how can that be? Well, here's how it can be. Here is the red line shows the spending under the House GOP budget. But in this amendment, in this legislation that has come to us, not only do they adopt the House Republican budget, they then trump it. They then override it with a constitutional amendment that goes even further. So here is the spending under the House Republican plan. It goes from 24% of GDP down to 19.9. Then it's leapfrogged by the provisions of the constitutional amendment that would take spending down to 18% of GDP. From 24.1 to 18. That's a 25% cut if you took the cut across the board. But their plan doesn't take the cut across the board. It shields certain things. And so the cuts to those things that aren't shielded have to be more draconian and even deeper. Mr. President, just visually, I thought I should produce a chart that shows what would happen if you had to reach the limit that is in the constitutional amendment that is before this body today. With an 18% cap on all gross domestic product spending, here's Social Security, that's 5% of gross domestic product. Defense and other non-health spending, as you can see, over 15%, takes you well over 15%. Then you've got interest, and you're at their cap. There is no money for Medicare. There is no money for Medicaid. There is no money for any of the other health care accounts. If they just hold harmless Social Security, defense, and other non-health spending, and of course we got to pay interest on the debt, there's nothing left over. That's why I call this cap, cut, and kill Medicare. I should have added cut, cap, and kill Medicaid. Cut, cap, and kill every other health care account. Mr. President, this plan caps spending going forward at draconian and unrealistic levels. It fails to account for the retirement of the baby boom generation and rising health care costs. Perhaps more remarkable, it provides no war funding for 2013 to 2021. None. Let me repeat that. This plan that has come over from the House is so ill-considered, so hastily thrown together, so lacking in credibility that they provide for no war funding after 2013. Does that mean they're advocating bringing all the troops home from every location, everywhere around the world? Well, I'm certain not, because that's not the position they've taken. But they don't provide any money for it. Mr. President, I don't know who slapped this thing together, but they weren't very careful in what they did. None of it adds up. It is totally make-believe. Mr. President, this is not make-believe. This is what's going to happen to the number of people who are eligible for Medicare and Social Security running up to 2050. The number of people eligible is almost going to double. That is a demographic tidal wave that is a reality. It's not a projection. These people have been born. They're alive today. They're going to retire. They're going to be eligible. And this amendment before us makes no provision for them. So what's going to happen? They're going to shred Medicare. They're going to shred Medicaid. And they're going to put at risk Social Security. That's as clear as it can be. Mr. President, here's the reality that we confront today as a nation. Spending as a share of GDP is the highest it has been in 60 years. But revenue as a share of GDP is the lowest it has been in 60 years. Both these are facts. Both these are true. And our friends on the other side are saying, you cannot touch the revenue side of the equation, even if it is closing tax havens, going after abusive tax shelters, going after tax scams that proliferate the tax code today. They say, oh no, you can't touch that. You can't make any changes on the revenue side of the equation, even though the revenue is the lowest it's been in 60 years as a share of our national income. They say it would take a 2/3 vote, and they would put it in the Constitution of the United States that they would require a 2/3 vote to close any tax haven, any tax shelter, any abusive tax scam. Take a 2/3 vote. Mr. President, that's not what I learned about when I was growing up, about the Constitution of the United States. It didn't say anything about protecting those who engage in tax scams and tax havens and abusive tax shelters. But that's what this plan would do. Mr. President, the Washington Post back in May did an analysis. How did we get into this ditch that we're in of runaway debt and runaway deficits? How did we get into this position? And their conclusion after this study was that the biggest culprit by far has been an erosion of tax revenue triggered largely by 2 recessions and multiple rounds of tax cuts. Together, the economy and tax bills enacted under former President Bush and to a lesser extent by President Obama wiped out $6.3 trillion in anticipated revenue. That's nearly half of the $12.7 trillion swing from projected surpluses to real debt. Federal tax collections now stand at their lowest level as a percentage of the economy in 60 years. And this amendment before us would require a 2/3 vote to do anything about it? Mr. President, let's get serious. As I say, I've been part of every serious bipartisan effort here over the last 2 years to come up with a plan to get our debt under control. To, yes, cut spending, yes, reform entitlements, yes, to get the revenue base recovered so that we can reduce our debt. But, Mr. President, this plan before us is a disaster. Now, let's look at reality. The last 5 times the budget's been in surplus in the last 40 years, revenue has been close to 20% of GDP. This plan would require a 2/3 vote to increase any revenue. And revenue is at 14.5% of GDP. Wow. You talk about consigning this country to an endless round of economic uncertainty and an undermining of the economic position of the United States. Just vote for this thing. Mr. President, Martin Feldstein, who's one of the most conservative economists in the country, has said we've got to take on these tax expenditures. Tax expenditures now amount to $1.1 trillion a year. We are spending more through the tax code than we are in all appropriated spending every year. And yet this amendment would require a 2/3 vote to change any of those tax expenditures, to close any of the tax loopholes, to go after any of the tax havens, the abusive tax shelters. Mr. President, here is Martin Feldstein, professor of economics at Harvard, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Reagan. Under President Reagan, this is what he said: cutting tax expenditures is really the best way to reduce government spending. Tax expenditures is really the best way to reduce government spending. Eliminating tax expenditures does not increase marginal tax rates or reduce the reward for saving, investment, or risk-taking. It would also increase overall economic efficiency by removing incentives that distort private spending decisions and eliminating or consolidating the large number of overlapping tax-based subsidies. Would also greatly simplify tax filing. In short, cutting tax expenditures is not at all like other ways of raising revenue. And interestingly enough, every bipartisan commission has come back and said, as one part of dealing with our deficits and debt, we ought to reduce tax expenditures. It's just spending by another name. But you know what? The legislation before us would require a 2/3 vote to change any of these tax expenditures. Mr. President, because it raises revenue. Raises revenue. So they're against that. Here's where the tax expenditures go. The top 1% get 26% of the value of tax expenditures. Mr. President, you know, these loopholes that have proliferated have gone to the very top. And we're going to have to reform this tax code, take out the junk, and we're going to have to, at the same time, go after these offshore tax havens and tax shelters that some of the very best off among us, the most fortunate, are using to dodge what they legitimately owe in this country. You know, they call this legislation cut, cap, and balance. They should have called it preserve, protect, and defend tax havens and tax shelters, because that's in effect what it would do. They say if you go after these tax havens, these tax shelters, that's a tax increase. That increases revenue, therefore it'd take a 2/3 vote to do anything about. Let me just say to my colleagues, this is a little building down the Cayman Islands, a little 5-story building. Claims to be home to 18,857 companies. They all say they're doing business out of this little building. This is the most efficient building in the world. It's unbelievable. 18,857 companies say they're doing business out of this little building. That is a remarkable accomplishment, to be running 18,000 businesses out of this little building. How can that possibly be? But of course it's not. The only thing they're running down there is a giant tax scam on all the rest of us who pay what we owe. We aren't down in the Cayman Islands. By the way, it has no taxes that apply to these businesses. We're right here. We're filing our taxes and we're paying them. These companies are dodging theirs. Mr. President, if anybody doubts that this has become a huge hemorrhage for the U.S. Treasury, here is what our own Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations found. Experts have estimated the total loss to the Treasury from offshore tax evasion alone approaches $100 billion a year, including $40 to $70 billion from individuals, another $30 billion from corporations engaging in offshore tax evasion. Abusive tax shelters add tens of billions of dollars more. Mr. President, I'll tell you, before we raise taxes one thin dime on any of the rest of us who are paying our taxes, let's go after these folks who are dodging their responsibility and their obligations. And this amendment before us would require a 2/3 vote to do it. Mr. President, that's not the end of it. The wealthiest 400 families in the United States, here's what's happened to their tax rates, their effective tax rates since 1995. In 1995, their effective tax rate was 29.9%. By 2007, it was down to 16.6%. The wealthiest among us have had their tax rates about cut in half. I don't know about you, I didn't have my taxes cut in half. And the vast majority of Americans didn't have their taxes cut in half. But with the help of well-placed lobbyists here, those who are the most fortunate have had their tax rates cut in half. Mr. President, this amendment before us would say it would take a 2/3 vote to change it. That's why I say this amendment should be called Protect, Preserve, and Defend Tax Havens and Abusive Tax Shelters. Mr. President, the last time the top rate was 39.6%, we experienced the longest period of uninterrupted economic growth in U.S. history. Those who say you raise any revenue, you kill jobs, really? That's not what history shows. The last time we had a comprehensive plan to cut spending and raise revenue to reduce the debt during the Clinton administration, we kicked off the longest period of uninterrupted economic growth in U.S. history. 39 straight quarters of economic growth, 32 of those quarters during the Clinton administration, and 24 million jobs were created. Mr. President, dealing with the deficit and the debt in a balanced and comprehensive way doesn't kill jobs. It creates the climate for the creation of jobs because it improves the competitive position of the United States. Mr. President, I have been part of 3 plans to reduce this debt from what it would otherwise be by $4 trillion. The Fiscal Commission plan, I served. 11 of us, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 independent, endorsed that outcome. I was part of the group of 6, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. We produced a plan to reduce the deficits and debt from what they would otherwise be by $3.7 trillion. I was part of the Democrats on the Senate Budget Committee that unveiled a plan to reduce deficits and debt from what they would otherwise be by $4 trillion. So I've been happy to be part of bipartisan efforts, part of efforts just on our side of the aisle. And interestingly enough, every single bipartisan commission has come up with a package of about $4 trillion in deficit savings. And group of 6 did, I think, yeoman's work, bringing the deficits down from 9.3% of GDP down to 1.9%. But yes, we have revenue. And yes, we have spending cuts. And yes, we reform entitlement programs because all of that's necessary. This legislation before us says, whoa, wait a minute, we don't want to do it all. We want to focus on just part of it. This problem's too big to try to solve it with just part of the federal fiscal picture. It's going to take all parts to solve this problem. Mr. President, the group of 6, I'm proud to say, came up with a plan that stabilizes this debt and begins to bring it down in avoiding this skyrocketing debt that we are otherwise going to experience. But, Mr. President, this amendment, this legislation before us would stop it in its tracks. I think that would be a profound mistake. I hope my colleagues reject this ill-considered plan. I thank the chair and yield the floor.